So here's another post-mortem kind of thing for my game Slasher's Keep, which is a first-person roguelike with a combat system inspired by Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. Now, the project started out with a very different concept. The combat system I built initially worked thusly. You would click and hold the left mouse button, then your camera would be locked, only moving within a constrained angle, and the mouse would now drag your weapon hand across the screen. That's the backswing. Then you would click and hold the right mouse button as well, which would point your weapon forward, and you would draw it across the screen like you're slashing. If you clicked and held the right mouse button by itself, you would be in parry mode. The camera was still locked the same way, but the weapon hand would now be parrying instead of swinging. Then I had the orcs attack with their swings at randomized angles, so the parrying would provide some challenge. Unfortunately, I don't have a version of the game to show you with that system in place, but I can tell you it did work, and it did make the slashing and parrying feel more immediate. What it also did is it made the fights feel quite slow and disconnected from the rest of the game. Like, the game was basically a series of one-on-one encounters that all played out the same. So the pace was sluggish and the gameplay was quite boring, I feel. So I changed it dramatically and oriented myself toward the weapon handling in Dark Messiah of Might and Magic. So now you click for light swings, you click and hold, then release for heavier swings, and you modulate your swing by holding movement keys while clicking. Then in place of the almighty kick, I had the sack smack, which has you swinging with your inventory sack. The reason I didn't also go with the kick was I was determined to depict all equipment items on your weapon arm, so I drew images for all gloves and long-sleeve chest pieces, and to be consistent, I would have had to draw multiple animation frames for each pair of boots and pants. And the sack smack animation was much more efficient that way. And it gave an in-world explanation for not having two-handed weapons, seeing as the player's left hand is full. What I kept from the original combat system in Slasher's Keep was the weapon-precise parrying and randomized swings for the orcs and zombies. Except now your weapon is locked to the middle of the screen instead of the camera being locked when you're in parry mode. But you still have to aim at the incoming swing, meaning you have to hold your weapon in the way of the incoming weapon. And that's the reason the swing animations for the orcs and zombies are kind of slow. Now, they could be optimized to be telegraphed sufficiently and still look good, I think. But at this point, I'm not going back into that Frankenstein animation system I wrote and risk breaking everything again. Now, this new weapon handling system was much slicker, but I still thought it didn't yield an overall gameplay experience that was well-rounded. What I realized at some point was that in changing the weapon handling, I changed the whole dynamic of the gameplay, so that now that you could move around freely while fighting, the movement, or the footwork, if you will, was integral to the combat, which is especially apparent with the sack smack, which has you baiting enemies to stand in front of spikes, then positioning yourself so you could smack them into the spikes. So I had to make the level design reflect that dynamic, right? I think what I took inspiration from then was 2017 Doom, which had a very slick level design with these areas that were essentially arenas where you had to constantly be moving and jumping around to outmaneuver enemies, which had their own ways to move about the environment. And I thought that was a neat, organically designed marriage between the combat and the level design. So I thought, what kind of room type could I make that allowed the player to outmaneuver the enemies with the player's own special skills that the enemies don't have, essentially? And how can I make that procedurally generated as well? And ideally, it had to work within the grid system of the dungeon generation. And what I came up with is what I internally called the master room, because it is genetically superior to all the other rooms. And how it works is it takes a basic Perlin noise function for the height of the floor tiles, then it goes through and marks connected areas of the same height, then it connects them with little stairs, recursively checking for connectivity until they're all connected. Then the ledges get rails and randomly placed boxes in front of the rails that the player can use to jump over the rails. So the player can use those as shortcuts while the enemies have to use the stairs. And that's how the player can somewhat reliably outmaneuver the enemies in the room. And later I added randomized pits and chasms with little bridges for variety, and also so the player can lure enemies onto the bridges and smack them off into the chasms. Because again, the sack smack is integral to the combat, and the combat is connected to the level design, right? And then I also made the room type work as a compound room with other types and added more bits for variety. So all in all, I am satisfied with how this room type worked out, and I was able to use that platform system, as in having grid tiles of different heights and having little stairs to get up to the platforms in other rooms as well for ready-made bespoke elements. So yeah, combat and level design go hand in hand. It's the kind of thing you may not fully realize when you're spending lots of time with the minutiae of the combat system. You know, the player holds the button this long and then that animation plays, and at this point in the animation he can queue up another attack, and so on. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that's all there is to it, right? Especially when you start out with a much more insular kind of combat system like I did, where each encounter was separate from the next, and then you go to a more holistic kind of combat system, you know? So, in a game, as in any artwork, ideally, all the small parts have to come together to create larger parts, which come together to create larger parts, and so on. And then you have a whole that is greater than the sum of its parts, right? So now comes the more general part of the rant, I guess. As a player turning into a developer, you may be basing your game design on an array of design conventions, like bits of game design you take from different games you like, and you may want to put them together because you're making a game of that genre, right? What you may not realize from the start is that each of those bits of game design or mechanics has a function within its respective game, right? That doesn't mean they can't fit into your game at all, but they may not mesh perfectly. I think we, as in the greater gaming public, may be thinking of genres too superficially, which may be more of a failing of language than of meaning. You know, when we think of a genre, we might think of a list of elements that must be present for a game to be of that genre, right? Like an RPG has character progression, so we think of stats and levels and stuff, and then we make an RPG and try to copy and paste those elements the way they were presented in other games so that it superficially appears like a proper RPG, not realizing that those elements have to perform a function for the rest of the game experience. So we may not see the forest for the talent trees. Speaking of which, I had those in my game too, for that exact reason. And then I found out they didn't suit my game, because for one thing, it's a roguelike, not a big narrative RPG with characters and a big open world and stuff. So the gameplay doesn't have that broad of a scope. It's all combat and a bit of crafting. Secondly, there was no way for me to make the combat varied enough to justify big skill trees that included every skill and have them all be viable options. The way I had them implemented, there was just one build that was clearly the best, and that would make the runs too similar for a roguelike. So in keeping with the roguelike theme, I put the skills on the randomly generated items and also gave them out as randomized quest rewards and stuff. And then you can pick and choose a few skills that you can make permanent on your character with points that you gain from leveling. So that's going from a superficial characteristic to an abstract one, really. You know, genres aren't all the same in what exactly they're describing, right? Like RPG tends to be superficial and roguelike is quite abstract, which is counterintuitive because the names themselves are the opposite. Role-playing game is abstract, and roguelike refers to a specific game that most roguelikes have little resemblance to. But I digress. I will make a separate video on genres. How's that? So what I'm talking about here is holistic game design, right? All the bits of your game should serve the experience as a whole. especially those that overlap and interact. That's the thing with the combat. You swing your sword, but you also move around, so the swinging and the moving has to make sense together, and you also move around the environment, so the moving and the environment have to make sense together. And now the environment and the combat have to make sense together, right? So that's where I got my spikes and chasms that you can knock folks into. But I am speaking generally here. So then you could say the environments are connected via the level structure, so that makes the narrative of the game, so to speak. So the narrative is connected all the way down to you swinging your sword, which is how we got that goofy phrase, ludonarrative dissonance, for when that connection feels tenuous. Funnily enough, I think when you look at it from that far away, it becomes reasonably clear how you get from game mechanics to narrative, or the other way around. Now that's an interesting topic too. How do you approach your game concept? Do you go from mechanics to narrative, or from narrative to mechanics? And if you ask me right now, I'd say both approaches can be equally fruitful. Perhaps it depends on the designer, you know, how they think about games. Personally, I've had ideas coming from both directions, but whichever approach you pick, you ought to be aware of the other end, because that's where you're headed. Anyway, that's the video. Here's an ad for my game. Slasher's Keep is a first-person roguelike with a focus on melee combat and loot. It has randomly generated dungeons with orcs, mole rats, and other monsters to fight, lots of loot to find, and a drag-and-drop weapon crafting system. I made it all by my lonesome, and it's available for PC on Steam.